I want to take you back to March of 2021 to Walmart store number 2050 in Henderson, Nevada, just outside of Las Vegas. And I'm sitting in a hard-back chair, an uncomfortable plastic chair, waiting the obligatory 15 minutes to see if there's any side effects of the vaccine. And I didn't experience any side effects at that moment, but it did experience an existential crisis. You see, I'm holding on to that card, and I'm holding it and flipping it over in my hands and wondering, how is it that my short, mid, and long-term health care is going to be dependent on a piece of paper? And is this the best that the American healthcare infrastructure can do? And I know not all countries, everybody's different, but I'll just talk about America. And then I started to look at all the bits and pieces on that card. And you can see that I took Moderna batch number 002B21A. And I started to think, where did that come from? Was it stored at the proper temperature throughout the chain of custody? And where did the source materials come from? How is it I just put a vaccine in my body and I know nothing about its provenance? And then I realized that not only do I have all this information here, but now I have to give it to my employer, to the government, to my healthcare provider, and goodness knows who else. And I have to manually enter it. And I thought, this is silly. I have my credit cards, my passport, my transit cards on my phone, now my watch, and I have a piece of paper. So I went home in a snit, and started to map out Eloise's simplified view of the supply chain, or the vaccine supply chain. And you can see our source materials, you can see that it gets manufactured, and you have the batch numbers. Then from there, and as I said, I got a Moderna shot, then it went to distribution, third-party logistics, and air, land, sea, who knows, I don't know. Then it went to the Walmart distribution system. And then from there, it went to regional distribution centers, DCs, and then eventually to the pharmacy where it got injected into my arm. And then from there, then it got injected, and then I had to then give the data over to my healthcare provider and everybody else. And what I realized when I got home, in the midst of the lockdown with nothing else to do, is I realized why does that data not carry through from the source material all the way to my electronic health record? And that's when I realized why this is all so broken. Because none of these entities, and there's at least 10, if not 20 or 30 or 40 entities that touch that vaccine and that information, none of them are integrated. None of them are even incented to integrate. Maybe you have Moderna to Walmart integration, but what about all those third-party logistics providers? What about my healthcare provider? How is this is the modern supply chain? And so ultimately, it's in reaction to this that I started working on my new book. Also, my previous book had just released or was getting ready to release, so I needed something to occupy my time. And so this is really what the problem is with most supply chains. When we extend supply chains for cost optimization, it makes them very brittle and very susceptible to risk, because underpinning that is all the data, and our inability to exchange data creates this fragility. And so if we look at an enterprise supply chain, it looks something like this. Plan, source, make, deliver, ideally reverse logistics, quality somewhere in there, data management, all looks to be, and by the way, I'm being kind here, because a lot of companies don't even have it this clear. Or they have a proliferation of ERPs, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially, this is, you can take any enterprise, it sort of falls into these buckets. But the problem is that this assumes that the enterprise is the king of the hill, that every supplier is sublimated to them. And even worse is we assume that all of this can be handled by an ERP system. And if I wave my magic wand or I press the magic button and give you an end-to-end, fully integrated, fully deployed, single, clean instance of ERPs, that would not be enough because there's going to be one critical piece missing: interactions with third parties. And if you go back to my vaccine example, the ability to exchange data with third parties, ERP systems don't do that. They were not designed for that. They were designed in the 90s. And so the ERP is dead. I keep saying this, and it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a decade before we really internalize this. But the ERP is dead because it does not facilitate all of those third-party handoffs. And I'm going to just show you a very complicated picture, and this is my argument. You can read my book and get more into the nuances of this, but I'm just going to show you visually because I want to build to something. So just forewarned, you might get confused here, and I'm going to go a little fast just to sort of make the point. But my argument is the ERP is dead, and in the 21st century supply chain, you're still going to have plan, source, make, deliver, reverse logistics, and you're going to have all the functional capabilities, and you might buy systems, you might buy ERP systems, you might buy source-to-pay systems, but you also might build your own. And I do a lot of research in my new book around what Amazon did, because they built their own, and others are starting to build their own to solve some of these capabilities. But then you have what I call a filter or a layer of risk and ESG, because everything we do has to pass through this filter of risk and ESG. And then in between that, we have our cloud platform capability. So every time we talk about analytics, every time we talk about AI and machine learning and all that, we have to start thinking about those libraries sit in the cloud platforms, AWS, Google, or Azure. And so are we actually using those cloud platform capabilities? And then finally, in the middle, we are going to have our user experience, our App Store integration, our data foundation, which is highly relevant right here, and then, of course, intelligence. Now, I could spend hours talking about this, but I just wanted to give you a feel for this is what the future supply chain technology stack looks like. It's going to be more cloud-based than ERP-based. And you'll see why here in a second. Because if we take that and then we start to overlay all the third parties we have to exchange data with, this is what it starts to look like. And this is why an ERP cannot do that. And how we thread this all together, just to make the point, thanks, somebody got the joke there. Look closely, you'll get it. Is you can thread this all, we will thread this all together with supplier data. And that is super, super important. But even this view is wrong. This view is just the beginning. Because, as I said before, we frequently assume that the enterprise is at the top of the hill. But that's not going to be the case in an end-to-end supply chain. And so what I would argue, and this is where it gets complicated, is your enterprise or an enterprise will be like this, and all of its third parties will have their own infrastructures like this. And it'll be much more federated amongst enterprises, because this is how we're going to start to solve this. And so what I hope you take away is the idea that everybody's going to be on equal footing, and we're going to win by how well we exchange data with third parties. Because to put it into context, as a consumer, I don't care about what Walmart wants to do versus what Moderna wants to do versus what my healthcare provider wants to do. I want one single continuous data flow. And if the individual entities aren't going to give it to me, eventually governments will force this. And so we have to start changing how we think about this. And by the way, I know I'm early on this journey, and I'm going to be screaming in the wind for 10 years, and then I'll retire. But make no mistake that some version of this has to come to pass. because we're spending billions of dollars on ERP systems that, even if they worked perfectly, aren't delivering. All right, so I'm going to pivot here slightly. We're going to have a little fun, or not a little fun, but little amusement here. So I want to start orienting you to how we interact with our suppliers. Because as we talked about innovation, risk, ESG, we bombard our suppliers with all this information requests. But my question to you is, we're asking the questions, but are the suppliers understanding what we're asking? And so this quote came up, and when it came across my desk, I'm like, it's going right in my book. And there's a question. This is a legitimate question. I've modified the language a little bit, but this is a legitimate question and response. The question is to the supplier, do you measure your greenhouse gases? It's a legitimate question. And the answer was, we don't have any greenhouses. We're not in the agriculture business. And so my question to you is, are the questions you're asking what the supplier is understanding? And this goes for risk. Do you know how many risk surveys that I respond to or comment on? And even if I want to answer truthfully, I may just not understand the question. And so this is where we have to start putting ourselves in the supplier's shoes and starting to understand their pain. And so what I would argue is that when we start to put ourselves in the supplier's shoes, it changes. It changes how we approach them. And so I would argue, and this is going to be true for us as citizens, increasingly we're going to find that we need to own our data. And I would argue that suppliers are going to increasingly own their data. Because right now, every time they submit data to the 400 times they enter into SAP and then 400 times into Coupa and on and on and on, that's horrible experience and horribly inefficient, and there's no incentive for them to keep it up to date. And my argument is we need to start to move to a digital wallet. And much like as I described for our healthcare and my credit cards and transit cards and the like, we actually need to start thinking about where suppliers own their data and then it gets syndicated to all those systems. Now, technically how we do it, I think you're going to hear more about that later today, or at least I'm led to believe that. So I'll be curious to hear technically how we do it, but change management-wise, we have to incent the suppliers and actually give them benefit for our data. In fact, all of us as individuals, as global citizens, our data should become part of our human rights. Because right now, the big tech companies take our data and use it to make their algorithms better so that they can manipulate us and make money off our data. And that will change. That is changing. That will continue to change. And the same is true for supplier data. Because there's nothing worse, and I've written about this extensively, than a source-to-pay system taking the supplier data. They charge the enterprise that they're serving for that data, and then they turn around and they mine that data and sell that back as insights. So they're double dipping. That's not cool. And the supplier gets no benefit. So we have to start to ask, how is the supplier getting benefit? And this is when we start to incent them in suppliers, they will start to keep their information up to date, and we won't be running around chasing suppliers to update their data because they will be incented, they will own it, and they will have it once in their wallet and submit it out there. And when we do that, when we have this mythical digital wallet, the supply chain that in this case, going back to the vaccine supply chain, we'll be able to track that data throughout, and we'll own that throughout. And that's really important. And so what I want to convey is that we have to think about this from the supplier's point of view, and not only from the experience, but architecturally, so that we're facilitating easy exchange of data with the suppliers. And if there's one takeaway I want you from the book, if there's one thing I want you to take away from the book, it's that third-party data exchange is the key to the future. It is fundamentally the key to the future. And so I'll conclude here. I showed this in the first supplier experience forum, but it's providing a delightful, easy way for suppliers to interact with company systems. And we have all the stuff on the right, all the considerations, all of that. That's still true. I just wanted to anchor back to this idea, because I hammer this message home on a weekly basis, over and over and over again. I think people are tired of hearing me talk about it, but I'm not going to let up. But we have to ask, and I showed this last year for those that came to my session, but I want to bring it back because I think this is important, and this really gets at this. We have complexity at the wrong place. And so if you've seen this meme, this is the typical Apple product. Something you just get an interface and you touch something and things happen. And the Google interface is you have a search bar and you enter in text and something happens. And then this is your company's application. Or in this case, this is your supplier onboarding, whatever. Not HIX, but the traditional SAP. And just to pick on SAP a little bit more, if you think this is kind of a joke, this is Kearney's new SAP deployment. And this is what it looks like. You've got tabs upon tabs upon tabs. I don't even understand this interface. And I'm a digital person, and I love technology. This is totally, totally unusable to me. And I don't even use the system. I have to have my EA, Emily, put the data in because I can't figure the system out. And actually, if you look at the underlying code, it's got Java applets that were developed in the early 2000s. How embarrassing is that if you work for SAP? By the way, I'm assuming SAP is not represented here, but it wouldn't be the first time I've made that mistake. And so this is not, if you give me something like this as a supplier, that's not good enough. We have to get beyond this. And so in the age of Gen AI, and I've made it 23 minutes without saying Gen AI, we're going to start to get those Google and Apple-like interfaces. But you can't rely on the CIO. If you think I'm coming for ERPs, I'm absolutely coming for CIOs. So don't share my book with them because they won't like it. And so we have to really think about this because the problem is the risk sits in our third parties. If I want to, so the title of my book is How to Hack Your Supply Chain. If I want to hack your supply chain, guess where I'm coming? Through the third parties, and I don't care how far down the line I go, I'm coming through the third parties. That's it. That's the thesis of the book. And so, to close here, when we think about supplier segmentation, this is a great supplier framework. This is Kearney's framework. I love it. It works. Everybody's used it a million times, blah, blah, blah. But this has nothing to do with risk or ESG. And if we really want to build defensible supply chains, we need to look at it like this. And we have to take a whole chunk of those suppliers and move them out of our core systems and really think about how we are defending against our supply chains and how we're managing that data. Because onboarding all these suppliers and putting them into our core systems is a gigantic security risk. And I spend a lot of time teasing that apart. And so ultimately, any enterprise can only manage 100 suppliers effectively. And there's perhaps another 900 that you could semi-manage, and I'm using these as rough numbers. But if you have more than 1,000 suppliers, guess what? You're not managing them. And so we have to get beyond this and really think about who's in our system and what are they doing? And what information do we need? Because with that tier one, you're going to have deep integration. Or I would argue you need deep integration so you don't create these security risks. Tier two, you're going to have some integration, again, to bypass those risks. But everyone else, get them out of your system and create a layer of defense around that. Thank you.